Um, I think it's 10:30, but I can see that some people are still joining. So perhaps we will wait for a couple of more minutes before we start formally. But before we start the session, I can see we have participants from Nepal as well as other countries. And my request to everyone is to engage in the discussions and try to make it interactive because that's what we want. After the presentation and discussions, we will have about half an hour or so for question and answer. So let's try to make it not very formal. We can have a semi-formal kind of an event, a discussion. And I would like to encourage everyone who are participating to be active, to put your comments, your questions, anything, any observations that you have in the presentations or beyond the presentations within the topic that we will be discussing today. And we will have both options open actually. You can even speak directly with your comments, questions, or you can also write them in the chat box. I would prefer you do the former, speak yourself with your comments, questions. But if you're more comfortable writing it in the chat box, we'll be happy to take those as well. I think we should start because we do not want to penalize people who are already here and who are on time. So as we move on, perhaps some more participants will join us, uh, but let's not wait longer. So welcome everyone and good morning, good evening to all of you as is relevant wherever you are. This session today that we are organizing on the macroeconomic and fiscal challenges and what Nepal's options are, this is part of a capacity building project that we have been undertaking for the past 1 year or so. This is being supported by USAID, and this is being implemented by PSC support and SANEM, South Asian Network on Economic Modeling, a think tank that is based in Dhaka, is doing the regional coordination work. And I have been looking at this project on the Nepal side. Normally, in other sessions, we have identified participants whom we send invitations and informations in specific sessions. But some of the sessions like this one, we try to make it open because this is very topical, and we thought that this would be of interest to many people in Nepal as well as beyond, because we all are going through some sort of the same challenges in these different countries. Hence, we have tried to make this an open session. And we are happy that we have got interest and participation from many people in Nepal and beyond. So today's session, the topic makes it clear that we are actually in times of these macroeconomic fiscal challenges. Many countries are facing this. And the situation that we saw in one of our neighboring countries in South Asia, Sri Lanka, I think that made it fearful for many other countries, whether the countries would also go along the same line. In Nepal's case in particular, although we did have these various economic impacts from COVID, but I think our macroeconomic fundamentals were not that bad. We were able to get over it quite well. But then the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, and through the different transmission channels, we have been seeing those effects now, especially on inflation, and then also on the current account deficit front, on the balance of payment front. There have been some problems, but although the latest data, the 1 month data of this current fiscal year that was published by the central bank, shows that there have been some improvement also on the trade deficit front. But the question is whether these are sustainable. What are the reasons that we have been doing well? There are some policy measures that the government had taken in order to reduce the trade deficit, especially in terms of banning imports as well. Perhaps that might have worked to some extent. But the other side of the coin is also the fall in revenue because of the fall in imports, because a large part of Nepal's revenue is based on the one that we collect at customs. So this is going to have some challenges on the fiscal front as well. The rise in interest rate is helpful in terms of taming inflation, but then it's not good for businesses, which are still reeling from COVID-19. So we have all these different challenges that we have been facing, and similar to many countries around the world, actually, not only in our region. So in this context, we wanted to have a discussion on what are Nepal's challenges at present, and what are Nepal's options, actually, what we can do about it in terms of addressing those challenges. So we have two very eminent people with us today to discuss this. Dr. Biswash Gauchan, he is the Executive Director at Institute for Integrated Development Studies, a think tank that is based in Kathmandu, and a very old one that was established in 1979. Dr. Gauchan, earlier, he used to work with UNDP. He was in Nepal and Africa. He's done a lot of work earlier as well, and he writes extensively on economic policy issues. So we have Dr. Gauchan, who will be making a presentation, and he has said that he will take maximum 45 minutes. And then we will hear from Dr. Gunakar Bhatta. Dr. Bhatta is Executive Director at Nepal Central Bank, that is Nepal Rastra Bank, Central Bank of Nepal. And he has worked in the central bank for more than 20 years. He has also led the monetary policy formulation and many financial policy formulation teams within the central bank. He was also part of the Revenue Advisory Board of the Government of Nepal. So we have two very eminent people to talk to us today on this very topical topic. You might be very eager to hear from them and to see where we are. Therefore, without much further ado, I want your time. I would like to invite Dr. Gauchan for the presentation. So Dr. Gauchan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sharma, for this opportunity. I have around 30 slides, so probably I'll be taking around 45 minutes to the maximum. And then, as you said, that we'll have a discussion later on. So let me share my slides.
Yes, you can see it.
Okay. Okay, so since today we'll be talking about macroeconomic fundamentals of Nepal, I would like to take you through the history of at least for the last 5 decades, what has happened in Nepal, and then to zoom in the current situations that we are facing, especially since COVID, and what are the way forward in terms of both monetary policy and the fiscal policy to address current challenges that we are facing. So I'm covering economic growth, price stability, external sector stability, and financial sector stability. These are the 4 core components of any macroeconomic analysis, and I'll be doing it for past 3 decades. So just to give you a sense of what has gone through Nepal in last 48 odd years. We have different phases of macroeconomic outcome. We have this up to 1990. We had a one party or a panchayat system. Where there was no multi-party system, and then followed by a multi-party democratic system that has happened, and then very immediately after that we went into a decade-long insurgency, and that has impacted macroeconomic fundamentals during that time. And then after that, we had this huge shortage of electricity, and that also has impacted our economic growth. And then after that is resolved, then we had a very high growth, economic growth under very mild inflation, and then COVID came after that, and then there are lots of exogenous shocks that the country is facing since last 2 years. So just to give you a historical sense of how we went through the last 5 decades. So the first panchayat regime of we have a data from 75. So 15 years of that period before 90s. It was a period of stagflation, and especially the 70s was very difficult for the country. Yeah, 70s was very difficult because of a series of drought, and at that time our agriculture sector used to contribute around 55% of GDP. So anything that happens in the agriculture sector will have direct impact on our overall economic growth. So there were at least 2 or 3 times when we had extreme drought and negative agriculture output, and that led to 70s of very low economic growth, and followed by 80s. 80s, in the middle of 80s, we experienced the situation like right now, where we have a BOP deficit of consecutive 3 years, and where the IMF had to chip in to help us in our BOP crisis during that time. And that led to an opening up of economy, and also that had some positive impact on our economic growth. So 80s have been a bit better in terms of economic growth, but the inflation was pretty high during that time. So in nutshell, what we can say is the panchayat kal of last 15 years had been a period of stagflation with GDP growth of around 4%, and inflation was close to 9%. And then we have this multi-party democratic system in 1990, and then it took a series of reforms, structural reforms with a very lasting impact in the country. And then that was able to sustain the economic growth of around 5% during that decade. But what happened was that decade was also a very highly inflationary period, especially because of the more than 20% devaluation of Indian currency against US dollar in 1991, when India faced this BOP crisis with only 1 week or 2 weeks of reserves, sufficient reserves to import. So then in the 96 we had this Maoist insurgency, and that then it took heavy dent on our economic growth. The investment was down. Both public and private investment was pretty low during that time, because Nepal is essentially a rural country, and there, because the Maoists had a major influence in the rural areas, so there's no way the government or the private sector could do real investment in the rural sector. So that dampened the overall prospect of economic growth and investment. But at the same time, that period happened to be a low inflation of those. The second half of Mao's insurgency was very, had a negative impact on our overall economic growth during that time. So that was a period of low inflation, but also very low economic growth. And what happened was the decade-long Maoist insurgency, because it didn't allow the capex to happen, capital expenditure to take place during that period. Then it had a consequence in the subsequent decade or so, with a very stark, power shortage during the next decade. That happened from 2006 to 2015 or so. So that period also, we came back to a situation of stagflation with around GDP growth of around only 4%, and inflation was quite high, close to 9%, which is just almost similar to that happened during the Panchayat regime. And it was essentially because of the power shortage. We still remember the days when we used to face 14 to 18 hours of power shortage during winter time. And then what happened was there was a number of good things happened at the same time. The power shortage, at least in Kathmandu and some cities, went out. The power shortage was suddenly, we felt like there's enough power and we could enjoy 24 hours of regular supply as far as the household is concerned. And then also the constitution, the new constitutions all rolled out. So these two factors really boost the sentiment very well. So lots of capex happened during those 3 years, and the next 3 years between 2017 and 19, those 3 fiscal years, was basically led by a very enhanced capital expenditure, capital formation, and that led to our economic growth of around 7.75% during that 3 years average, with very mild inflation. And the mild inflation was because also the India started having an inflation targeting from, I think, 2015. So it was able, the central bank in India was able to tame inflation during that time, and that also had a positive impact in inflation. So those 3 years in Nepal's economic history had been very good, with a very high economic growth and very mild inflation. And then, March 2020 came, where we have this the pandemic, set in, and then that had a very damning effect in our economic growth. But still, the inflation was relatively low during that time, even better than that of India during those 2 years. So in an average during that time, our GDP growth was close to 1%. But during the COVID year, our GDP was down by 2.37%, which happened, I think, almost after 40 years. We had a negative economic growth. But if you see the entire 30 years or 40 years, then our GDP is very low, around 4.4%. Inflation is around 7.5%. So it is, if we compare this with some of the countries in the South Asia, in South Asia, the highest inflation is in Sri Lanka, followed by Pakistan, and then I think Nepal is the third in that. And as far as economic output is concerned, growth is concerned, I think the lowest is Pakistan, and then Nepal among it. I think if you take out Afghanistan from the list, then so in terms of both economic growth and inflations, we are not faring very well in comparison to our neighboring countries in the region. So what happened was then, so that is the overview of last 50 years of our economic, outlook. Now, since 2018, I think every one of us know what has happened since 2018. We had a trade war between China and America that has a global implications, and then came COVID pandemic in 2020, and then supply chain disruptions and Ukraine-Russia war in 2022, February. So these are one after another, we are getting the global shocks, and it is of course going to have impact in a small economy like Nepal, which is in terms of trade, it is integrated with especially with India and the rest of the world. So in that sense, there is just lots of SOX channeling happening, transmissions happening to Nepal. And so those are the things that I'll discuss in the later slides. And because of these SOX, that there are lots of policy responses from every countries in the world, especially by the advanced countries with a massive fiscal stimulus. And if you take the average of advanced countries, the fiscal stimulus was as large as 28% of the GDP compared to 6% in emerging markets and 2% in the developing countries like Nepal. And then it led to negative to zero policy rate in the aftermath of pandemic by the central banks. The European euro had been in negative for almost a decade, and now they are trying to normalize now because of the inflation that's going on. And they have also undertaken lots of quantitative easing to address the situation in those countries. And now, since there's a change in the inflation outlook in advanced countries, essentially led by the geopolitical shocks in Ukraine, now the central banks around the world are trying to tighten the monetary policy, and that's of course going to have implications in emerging markets, especially, and also spillover effect. So what this policy response have led to a heightened level of sovereign debt. In advanced countries, it's 120% of GDP compared to 66% in emerging markets and 50% in developing countries. And now the latest IMF report says that at least 25% of the emerging market economies, have a debt stress, and almost 60% of the developing countries have a debt stress right now. So it's a huge, negative impacts due to this series of global shocks that we have faced in the last 2.5 years. So this has led to a question of that sustainability of these emerging and developing economies, and what happens when we have extremely accommodative monetary policy and also led by very accommodative expansion and fiscal policy. It normally leads to asset price inflation, and that's what we could see in advanced economies. But now, since the monetary policy is being tightened up, so it's going to have a negative impact on asset price inflation. And also, what happened was during the COVID, when the demand and was low, and there's lots of supply constraints, supply chain constraints, then because of the extremely accommodatory monetary policy, capital flew to emerging economies. And that's now in the process of reversing once the advanced countries have started tightening the monetary policy. And also it has implications of currency depreciation. Last year, our currency devalued by around 7%, and that's going to have a huge impact in our external debt when we put it in a local currency. So these kind of impacts are something that we are going to see in a developing countries like Nepal. So what are the transmission channels for Nepal? It affects through current account and capital account also. And there are other also channels like inflation, interest rate, and exchange rate, which are going to affect Nepal. But for exchange rate, it is through India, because we have a big exchange rate with India, and also interest rate probably through India. But inflation also, because 2/3 of our import happens with India. So whatever inflation is going to impact in India, that's also going to impact Nepal. So on the current account, I think that the largest shock is, of course, on the trade, because we are very much import dependent country. Our overall trade is 44% of GDP. It's not very high if you take the overall trade, but if you take only the import, which is around 40% of GDP, that's very high, even compared to our peers. And on the current account, we have remittance because we are over-dependent on remittance. So anything that happens in remittance is also going to impact us. But I think luckily there's not very much large negative shocks in the remittance part. So that part was taken care of. Otherwise, it was mainly from the import that we had there are lots of consequences in Nepal's external sector. And foreign grant has been pretty low in last few years. If you take the example of last 5 years, is only 0.7% of the GDP. And then on capital account, it's the largest part that affects our capital account is the ODA in the form of foreign loan. So if you take the average of last 5 years, it is 3.1% of GDP. So we haven't seen much impact in terms of the flows of external debt, despite having lots of negative global shocks. And commercial loan has been very low in the context of Nepal because we have not opened up capital account convertibility. And then also it is limited to only the commercial banks. So I think the stock of the external debt taken by the banking sector in Nepal is only around 0.8% of GDP. So in that sense, it is not a big issue. FDI has always been very low in Nepal. If you take an average, it is less than 0.4% compared to around 1.6% in India. But during COVID time, I think India even enjoyed more than 2% of GDP coming in the form of FDI. So we are very low in FDI. So there's not much also the changes in the flow of FDI. And portfolio, we don't have any portfolio investment in Nepal. We have not opened up that. And our other transmission channels are inflation. Yes, inflation is now creeping, and I think it's going to stay, especially from February after Ukraine crisis. We have seen more than 7%, and the last 3 months we have seen more than 8% on inflation, and that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we are going to face in coming months and years. And interest rate during the COVID had been very low, and now the inflation is getting high, and as well as the central bank has adopted a tighter monetary policy. They have increased the policy rate substantially, and that has effect on the short-term rates. But probably I'll talk about that later on how it is not going to much impact on the medium term interest rate in the context of Nepal, because the policy rate in Nepal is probably not that effective as it is supposed to be. And exchange rate, as I said, since it is pegged with India for so long, so anything that happens with the Indian currency, that's something that also happens with Nepal. So in last 2 years or so, there is a devaluation of our currency, and it's because of this external shocks that is affecting our exchange rate as well. So overall, the trade deficit in the balance of payment is 36.5% of GDP, and current account deficit is 12.8% of GDP, and EOP deficit is 5.3% of GDP. And if you take these three indicators on its own without relating it with some other important indicators, then it seems that Nepal is really in very much a problem. I think if you see these three data, then you can say that it is in the prices. But I think we have to put that in the context. It's something that I would like to do in the later slide. And there are also endogenous factors. We have been following very expansionary fiscal policy for quite long, and it has added to economic vulnerabilities. And because we actually had two consecutive election-driven fiscal policy or the budget, the 2021 and 21-22 and now 2022-23. Both are very expansionary. If you see, we'll go into that details later on. And also, we always had a very expansionary monetary policy, and that has led to a massive increase in the private sector credit. So these two have been there for quite long in Nepal's macroeconomic domain. And these are the things that we need to correct. If we keep on these things to happen in the future, then I think it is going to bring lots of trouble in our macroeconomic management. So these are things that we need to be very careful about. And if you see the credit in the last 10 years or so, I mean, our credit has to the private sector has increased by 2 times in just 9 years. So what is the impact of COVID on output? I did some analysis here, and I found out that I think in last 2.5 years or so since COVID, we lost around 6.6% of total economic output due to essentially due to pandemic. So this is the permanent scarring effect that our economy had experienced since COVID. So it's a very large loss of economic output. But what recovered very quickly, what recovered very faster? So it is the credit. Credit was the first sector to recover very fast. And if you see, if you do a trajectory prior to COVID for next 2 or 3 years, then we can say that credit has fully recovered by that time. And it is actually among all the sectors, credit was the first one to recover quickly after the COVID. And then since there is a direct implication of credit on our import, but the second sector that recovered very fast was the import. So, and then these two have, initially we thought that it is a good recovery, but very quickly we realized that probably it's not going in the right direction. The pace and the extent, the scale was probably not in tune with the external challenges that was bring up in the economy. And that's something that we realized only later. And then we started having lots of measures put in place to check that anomalies. But if you want to analyze Nepal's economic structure or what has driven Nepal's economy, I think I would say there are 4 things which have really driven Nepal's economy for quite long. So remittance is the first one, and then the credit, import, and land price. I think these are the 4 fundamental things that have really driven Nepal's economy for quite long. And because of these things, I think there are lots of challenges that we are going to face in the future if we do not tackle each of them in time. So let me go through all these 4 components, and then we can, after that, we can look for the way forward. Okay, remittance. Remittance is the largest source of our foreign exchange earnings. It is more than 56% of the total foreign exchange earnings that we do. But what has happened is that if you take the example of last 2 decades, The first 15 years had been very good in terms of the growth. We consistently grew by 20% in average in the first years. But in the last 5 years, the last 6 years, the rate of growth of remittance has declined to 7.3%. So for 15 years, 20%, and then now down to 7.3% in average for last 6 years. So these are going to have tremendous implications because our reliance on remittance is very huge. So anything that happens in the remittance is going to affect her. And our remittance actually already peaked during 2015 to 17, 2 consecutive years where it reached 25.5%. And during that time, Nepal has happened to be one of the 5 largest, recipient of remittance in terms of the GDP compared to GDP. But since then, it has declined, and now last year it has come down to around 21% of the GDP. The interesting thing is that every second household in Nepal receives remittance, both internal and external. So it's a huge, the structure. It shows the structure of our economy, our reliance on remittance, how much we really depend on remittance. But it includes both internal migration and also external migration. But surprisingly, the remittance, despite being so much in terms of the scale of the remittance that we are getting, but somehow it has not been able to generate saving and then to a capital formation. There are reasons for that, which probably I'll explain later on. And also, we have to understand that Nepal is not only one of the largest recipient of the remittance, but we are also the largest sources of outward remittance, because the remittance that flows out from Nepal to India is quite huge. And probably it is one of the largest economy. If you compare with the per capita income, our income level and the size of the GDP. So if we compare the remittance out from Nepal to India, and if we compare that with the size of our GDP and our income and our per capita income, then probably Nepal at the top 5 in terms of outward remittance. And there's so much of fervor for working abroad in Nepal, and probably there's no country where there is no Nepali. That's something that I have experienced myself. When I went to Africa, I thought that I would be the first person to be in that country, but quickly to realize that there are already so many Nepalese there. So I think probably we have more than 190 countries around the world, and there's no country where there's no Nepali. And we already have official NRN official networks in more than 80 countries. India is the largest source of migrant workers in the world. But despite having that, they don't have any official structure. But in Nepal, despite being a small country, we already have presence in 80 countries through official networks. And if you compare with the population, then the way that we are sending our people abroad as migrant workers is probably the largest. And right now, I think it has really picked up since the COVID. Now, 1,500 Nepali migrant workers are leaving the country every day. So that's a quite huge number. And also compared with the size of the populations, I think that we have the largest diaspora Nepali in the world. I think this will show how much we are reliant on remittance. And moving on to the credit to private sector, it has been very large. If you take the example of last 30 years, then it is 20.3%. On an average, year after year, 20.3% of private sector credit growth. But if you stretch beyond 30 years, if you take all those around 48 years or so, it is still 20%. So it is very high credit growth for such a long time, And probably there's no other country which has so, have such a high private sector growth for such a long time. But what has done to our economic growth or import or inflation, And we did some analysis here, some econometric, empirical studies we did, and we found that our private sector created growth has very little to do with the economic growth. And if you compare with the three, implications, the highest and the direct implication is at the level of the scale of the import. For 1% growth in private sector credit, there's 0.71% in the long run. And even it also has an immediate impact. In the short run also, there's a 0.62%. Whereas for inflation, it is 0.31%. In the long run, though it doesn't show a short-run impact. And for economic growth, it is only 0.23% in the long run, and it doesn't have any impact on the short run. So I think that this analysis is very important for the regulatory authorities, especially the government and the central bank, to understand what needs to be done to really address these situations that we have been facing for quite long. Just to give you an example, in our neighborhood, if you compare in the South Asia, we have the largest share of private sector credit growth in comparison to our economic output, GDP, 88%. This is the data of 2020. India is only 54.7%, Bangladesh less than 40%, So we are the highest, both in terms of the private credit and as well as the broad money. But if you take the example of, other income level group of countries, then if you see LDC, I think it's around 30%, which I can see here. Low income only 12%. And it used to be 30 years back, our credit was during time only 12%. And now the low income categories have around 12% of GDP as a private sector credit. And lower middle income, where we fall in terms of our per capita income, it is around 46%. Middle income is 120%. Upper middle income 143%, and high income 164%. And you can see that if the current average is to happen in next a decade or 2 decades, then what you can see is that in next 11 years time, our private sector credit will be double the size of our GDP, because there's a difference of around 7.5% between our credit growth compared to our nominal GDP growth. So that difference of 7.5% will lead to, this in 11 years time, our private sector credit will be twice the size of GDP, and in next 22 years, it's going to be 4 times. And if you relate this with the current level of credit in the high income category, where it is 164% of GDP only. So you can see the scenario in what is going to happen in next 11 years. We are going to be one of the highest country with the highest credit compared to our GDP. I think that we need to be really, taking these issues very seriously and start working on this. And some of the things that I have contributed to this is, of course, one of the draconian, measures that we took in 2015 to promote merger and acquisition in the country, because that time we had just too many kinds of institutions. But the whole onus of encouraging the DFIs to merge was the onus was given to the capital hike. 4 to 25% times the capital was high, and that had many adverse implications. And so far, no formal studies or research was done. Very surprisingly, So I really have been asking the central bank to take these things very seriously in terms of the implications, and the independent research needs to be done in this area. And that some of the things, what happened was there is a deluge of tier one capital. You can imagine when a commercial bank has to increase the capital by 4 times in just a matter of 2 years, then what happens in the economy? There's a misallocations of capital into one sector, which was already outsized during that time. It further, precipitated that. And then in terms of the outcome of this, only three commercial banks were reduced in number, from 30 to 27. Yes, there has been a success in especially in development banks and finance companies, but if you take the example of commercial bank, there was a very little impact on that. So overcapitalization led to a reduction in the ROE, so it reduced from 28% to 14 or 15%. So that led to a reckless lending. Probably I can use that word, and that also helped, increasing the size of the private sector credit. And it has also led to some credit misallocation, and why there's no growth coming, economic output growth coming, despite having such a long years of more than 20% of private sector credit growth year after year. I will just give you an example of the credit allocation in different sectors. Agriculture, right now, it contributes 24% to GDP. The credit that has been channeled through credit guidance as a part of credit guidance from the central bank is 13.2%, and those are some of the other sectors. And the largest beneficiary is trade. It contributes 16.4% to GDP, but the credit allocation in trade is 20%. Generally, it would be higher in trade, of course. But if you see the value addition of trade in Nepal, because we import, basically we don't produce. I mean, we are the economy which produces very less. Okay, in that context, when you have a very high credit allocations in trade, then I think there's the great mismatch through credit allocation. And the trade, because there's a very little value addition in trade, so mostly the 16.4% is part of the margin that these business firms are, getting, and there are lots of, middlemen in the process, and the ultimate, the consumers have to suffer because of the high prices and the margins that have been put by different middlemen. And also construction, because the construction is also has a very less value addition, though it helps create assets in the economy, but in terms of the value addition, because we rely heavily on imports from India and also for labor from India. So that's why having a greater allocation of credit to those sectors which have a very little value addition in that value chain, it's not good for the economy. And what I would like to show you a very interesting thing is that, yes, agriculture has been largest beneficiary if you see the growth of credit allocation in last 10 years and last 5 years. Agriculture has witnessed actually the largest growth of bank credit in the last 10 years by 11.3 times. And also in 5 years, last 5 years, 3.5 times. But despite such a huge, channeling of credit to agriculture sector, what has happened is that in last 10 years, the agriculture output has declined to 2.8% compared to 3.5% in the previous 10 years. It shows something is really wrong in our economy. And that's why I would like to, I have coined a new term here. We have heard about greenwashing, but it's interesting to see that agri-washing is very much prevalent in Nepal. So what does it basically mean is that the credit that has been channeled to agriculture sector in the phase has actually find its ways to go to other sectors which are less productive. So the central bank has to really look into this aspect. And the next one is on the import. We have, as I have been saying, that we are very much an import-dependent country. It was only because of the COVID that there is the break in the trajectory. So before COVID, our monthly import was 118 billion rupees, and there's already a slowdown actually because the last 3 years of high economic growth, very large 39% of GDP as a capital formation has led to a sort of overheating during that time. So before COVID, there was already some slowdown, and before COVID, our average monthly import was 115 billion. But what happened was because of the onset of COVID that it reduced, our importers reduced, whereas the remittance first 2 months declined substantially, but eventually picked up very quickly. So now, as I said, the first sector to recover in Nepal's economy post-COVID was import. So now if you see this, the chart here, you can see we are already in line with long-term trajectory of import. But against what also, if you see the import cover also, we had a 7.8 months of import cover, both mercantiles and services. Because of COVID, it went up to 12.7%, and then now it's below 7 months. But this year, first year, I think it's around 8 months or so because of the reduced import. But what I'm trying to show you in this slide is that whereas the import is now getting the momentum of long-term trajectory, and it has reached 160 billion monthly import last year, and that very much fits with the long-term trend. But against what is, you can see on the left hand side of the chart, the forex reserve. The forex reserve has become stagnant. If you see the pre-COVID fiscal year, the $9.5 billion, and now it's also 9.5 billion. But what has happened is there's the huge change, huge growth in the import. So if you see the changes, the growth in import during this time is that around 40%, the import has grown by 40% in these two periods, whereas the extent of foreign exchange reserve has remained the same, 9.5 billion. So this is the main reason that is, really putting lots of challenges in our economy. And the import and remittance until 2015-16, remittance used to cover our trade deficit, but since then the growth has widened up, as I said earlier, that now the trade deficit is growing at a rate of 19% on an annualized rate for last 6 years, compared to only 7.3% of remittance growth. So this huge gap has put lots of pressure on our external sector balance. And the asset price, the fourth one that characterizes Nepal's economy is the price of the land. And if you, it's interesting to find that we don't have very organized empirical study we have done, because we do not have asset price index in Nepal. I think last November, for the first time, Central Bank has come up with the asset price index for the first time. And in that very first year itself, it showed inflation of around 25 or 26% in that year. So, and then if you compare this with our credit growth, then they are at par. That's something that I did informally from my own sources. What I found is if I compare the asset price inflations of last 2 decades, then they are at par. So our inflation asset price has also inflated at par with the credit growth, which means around 20% or so. So it means every 3.7 years, the price of the land is increasing by double in Nepal. And that's exactly what is happening in the credit growth as well. So there's a very good, you can see the relationship between the private sector credit growth and the asset price inflation in Nepal. And you know, the profit, the margin that the firms or individuals in Nepal are generating from their business is actually used to is being used to buy lands. And I think that is a challenge that we are facing. And it has become also the most convenient and effective means of formalizing unaccounted income. So if you invest in land, no one asks you about the sources of your income. And when you sell it and pay a very little tax in terms of capital gain or land registration and all those other small taxes, then you can formalize it. So that's why lots of unaccounted money is also going into investing in land. So that is not very good for the country. And the monetization of land has inhibited capital formation, because what happens is that when you generate income or profit from a business, and when you start putting that money in buying land, then it breaks down the process of capital formation. And then most of the sellers of these lands are normal, households, and they tend to consume the last part of the process of land. They probably won't invest it or save it. They prefer to consume that in the form of buying a new car, going on a foreign visit, and so the process of the land is not being channeled into farming capital. So this land price is one of the biggest challenges that we have been facing for quite now. And if you compare with other South Asian countries, even with some of the advanced countries, the land price there and the land price here, you will be surprised the kind of land price that we have in Nepal. And so with this increase, such a high land price, land is no more a factor of production in Nepal. So we cannot use land, buy land to employ as a factor of production. So that gives a comparative disadvantage in terms of land as a factor of production. So let's now, having finished that explaining about those 4 characteristics of Nepal's economy, now I'd like to move on to the external sector stability, which is the biggest challenge that we are facing. How many minutes I have?
Dr. Gauchan, I didn't want to stop you because the presentation is really very interesting and going very well. But I think we are also short of time.
Okay. So I then quickly go through remaining slides and maybe more focus on what the way forward probably. So yeah, the biggest challenge, I'll just skip some of the slides also and some of the points here. The biggest challenge we face is that when the Forex reserve, in 10 months time since COVID, the Forex reserve, went up by $3.2 billion. That is unprecedented in the Nepal's history. 3.2 billion rupees it increased, and then the next 14 months it decreased by the same extent. So that brought lots of challenges in managing our external sector balances. I don't have to, this one, and also and foreign loan and grants together account for 11% of our forex inflows, which is quite huge. Even higher than the export of goods and services. I think this is very, very typical of Nepal. We hardly export anything, and so that leads to a situation where our official development assistance is higher than each of the export of services and goods. So that is something that we really, this shows the structure of our economy. And it is largely used for, of course, the import of goods and services. And if you see the composition of import, 24% of our total import is related to agriculture produce. Now, we are being an agriculture economy where 24% of the GDP it supports, but still we are importing 24% of overall import on agriculture produces. And the three largest import, agricultural goods, petroleum products, and vehicles together account for 45% of our total merchandise. And capital goods, very little. Actually, it's last year it was around 10%. This is 5 years average, 12%. Intermediary goods is large, 52%. But in the intermediary goods also, the value addition of our economy is very, very less. So that is very alarming, And the sovereign debt part, because most of the countries like ours are lots of debt stress, like Sri Lanka, followed by Pakistan. I think it's important to also understand what has happened in our context. Our external sovereign debt is still comparatively low, which is around 21% of GDP, around $8 billion. So on the external sector, relating to the external debt, we are quite comfortable. But what has happened is that the currency devaluations has added when we convert it to the local currency. For in the last year alone, our external debt in terms of local currency has increased by 68 billion rupees just because of the currency devaluation. And if you take the example since 2017, in the last 5 years, because of the devaluation by around 24% of our currency, the external debt has increased by close to 200 billion rupees in local currency. So that is the kind of impact that we see because of the currency devaluation. On the overall official development assistance, I already mentioned about that. And overall, ODA has been very much part of our, budget. If you see last 50 years, then you see quite a huge contributions of official development assistance, both in terms of overall public expenditure management and in particular our development public expenditure. So it's a large part is coming from official development assistance. And so since we are facing a challenge in the external sector in a country like Nepal, they will obviously impact on our overall financial sector stability. And there are already there are certain issues like oversized banking sector and the land price, evergreening of loans. Despite being that, we have a very low level of NPS of commercial banks. I think that's the lowest in South Asia. We have a relatively high capital adequacy. So these are some of the positives, but the oversize of banking sector, land price, evergreenings could be some gray areas where we need to focus. And there has been some stability because of the peg exchange rate with India, and no capital economic convertibility has also helped in preserving some level of stability in the financial sector. And I think from last year, we are experiencing extreme liquidity crisis in the country. We already had credit crunch. Now it's a liquidity crunch. At the aggregate level, the central bank can always smoothen the liquidity, but at the individual firm level, there could be some challenges in terms of managing their own liquidity. But at the aggregate level, the central bank will have all the ammunitions to address the liquidity crunches in the banking sector. And let me not go through that. So two things putting together, one positive and another negative. Negative, I already said on the the transmission channels, especially on the current account part. There's lots of negatives happening. But if we juxtapose that with some of the positive things, like the foreign exchange, the level of foreign exchange is at the reasonable scale. That's something that we have to acknowledge. 25% of GDP is our foreign exchange reserve, which is quite good. I think we have to take it in a positive note. Now the import cover has increased to now this first month 8, but last year it was around 6.9 months, which is also relatively very good. And low sovereign debt, 41%, and external debt is only 21%, which is also a good thing for the country. And also because most of these external debts were coming from multilateral institutions, the debt servicing is very low, and also the interest rate is up around less than 1%. Is positive on our side. Because of that, the external debt servicing happens to be quite low. And also on the commercial side, also the exposure is very low. So if we put these things together, we are not in that situation. But if you take only the negative side, and it gives you a sense that we are really in the crisis. But if you take it together with the positives, then probably it's not that negative. And there's always, in a country like Nepal, there's always politics over economy. Okay, but all the last 3 governments have been very much part of what was brewing up in the economy, especially on the external sector side. There's already a decline of foreign exchange reserve, and if there was no COVID, then we would have ended up with 3 consecutive years of BOP deficit. And that is somewhat related to mid-80s case, where we sought the help of IMF to help us with the BOP situation. So it's just because that the COVID was there, the import decreased drastically, the situation was pushed by 2 more years. So if you see some of the features of LDCs, these developing countries, in most of the cases we have common features, but there are also good things. Okay, the tax revenue is relatively high in the case of Nepal if you compare with our peers of low-income countries or LDCs, and the debt burden is around 41%, which is not that bad, and foreign exchange also is moderate. So if you take these 3, in most of the other indicators, we are pretty much at par with other peers. But if you take these 3 indicators, then probably we are doing better compared to other countries. Now, the fiscal policy, we had this, as I said, 2 consecutive election-focused, centered fiscal policies, and the goals were very unrealistic. 8% economic growth at when we have in a very trying times, and inflation of 7%, it's I think probably impossible to think through right now. NRB has done a survey where for next 3 months, and it came out that at least it will be a 13% or so, but probably will not reach that much, but it will definitely be around above 8%. That's what I can see. And some of the big the targets that the current government has made through its fiscal policies, like increasing the export by 100%, which is impossible. Increasing the productions of basic food items by 30% in 1 year, this is laughable. 30% employment growth is another laughable targets that the government has. So I don't really want to go through all of these targets, but we just focus on 8% economic growth and 7% inflation. Both seems to be extremely unrealistic. Now, if you go into some of the details, as I said earlier, that our fiscal policy has been very expansionary in recent years. In an average, if you take the last 6 years, it is around 36% of GDP, which is by any standard very, very high. But in terms of the delivery, it's only 80%. And that it shows the lack of accountability on the part of the government to the people, that they come up with a very large budget, but in terms of delivery, it's just 80%. As it shows the level of accountability that the government has. The revenue is quite good, the way that it has increased over the years. And if you, the current year targets is almost 26% of GDP, which is really impossible at this stage. And they have projected around 22% increase in the revenue collection this year, which is also not realistic given the extremely difficult times that we are facing. And on the very tight monetary policy that we are having. Capital expenditure is projected to be 7% of GDP, and budget deficit is quite high, 9%. In last 5 or 6 years, the average is 6.5% budget deficit, fiscal deficit, which is also very high. I think we need to, what I'm trying to say here is that there's austerity needed in the public financial management. With this kind of expenditure growth, I think it's not good for the economy. And I just wanted to share a lost opportunity when we had very comfortable foreign exchange reserve, and when the private sector was just getting credit for import. There's a time where the government has really did public capex to a very large scale to fill the gap, because there's a low capital formation from the private sector. What could the government have done was to increase the capex, because during that time, if you see this from 2011 to 2017, the forest was increasing every year. The average sovereign debt was only 26% of GDP. Budget was only 21%, and budget deficit only 22.5%. That was a time was when the government should have done a lot in the capex, and that would have really allowed crowding by the private sector. So that was a missed opportunity for us. And there are lots of policy axes. If you see the government budget, and I could see lots of accesses. One very obvious one is the senior citizen allowances. We spend 1.5% of GDP just for this allowance, where each individual of age 68 years or old, they receive 4,000 rupees per month, which is I think it's just a waste of money. 71 billion we have to spend, and that comes from our tax money. And if I compare that with the different sources of revenue, and interestingly, what I found is that all the tax that is collected from salary and individual, proprietary firm or businesses or income is actually to the extent of 71 billion. So whatever we as an employee or as something we are doing business on labor or personal income, every tax that we pay to the government goes on to paying allowances for the senior citizens, and I think this is not really good. And there's also this case that I have been from time and again, that the disproportionate privilege given to electrical vehicles is also unwarranted. It's not needed. I mean, if this has to happen and it's going to replace our fossil fuel vehicle, assuming the pre-COVID number of imports that we did, then we are going to lose around 50 billion of extra foreign exchange reserves in 1 year, and around 45 billion rupees of government revenue in terms of low import duties. So I think it's a very straightforward analysis. I think the central bank can easily do this one. There's no big data needed here to present this. I think these are the wrong policies that I can see. And another is cooking gas. So now we have to, there's still a subsidy, very large subsidy on cooking gas. Going by, this price, around 10 billion rupees we have to spend on subsidy for cooking gas. And who are the beneficiary of the cooking gas subsidy? It is basically the restaurants, hotels, higher upper class or middle class households, because only 1/3 of total households use cooking gas in Nepal, and mainly from the urban middle class. And the government has been very conducive in terms of this policy with respect to assembly plans and sales. And I don't think that these are the priorities for the country at all. If you take the whole premises of sales, I think we can't do much with the current policy. We need to redo these things. Because in the sales and assembly plans, the value addition is very less. If you take an example, assembly plans, the value addition is less than 5%, but the government is providing so much of facilities, privileges to those who are opening assembly. And surprisingly, we are the country with the highest minimum wage in the region. So that will give us some idea about our competitiveness. And there's a two consecutive salary hike by 20% and 50% in last for 3 or 4 years, which at a time when the inflation was quite low. So I think in that sense, the government has overdone on that part. Macroeconomic policy, it's a monetary policy. For central banks, price stability and external sector stability are the two prime objectives. And the most important monetary policy tool is the policy rate, and that is done through IRC, interest rate corridor, which was launched, I think, back in 2017. It was introduced for the first time. But if you see that if you analyze the last 5 years, the way the IRC was used, deployed, or how effective it had been, my sense is that in the context of Nepal, the policy rate is not really providing guidance, even to a short-term policies. Forget about medium and long-term, which actually is the goal of the central bank. But in Nepal's case, IRC has largely been very ineffective in providing interest rate guidance in the economy. So that's why the central bank has to use other tools to manage the aggregate demand in the economy. But there are lots of realities and challenges of Nepal. Nepal is landlocked. Not only landlocked, but landlocked by India and China. I think that's something that we have to understand. Landlocked is one thing, but landlocked by India and China is another thing. And also, I would say that it's also equivalent to double landlocked, in the sense that we are neighboring to Bihar and UP on the south and Tibet in the north. So these are the states. These are in terms of overall economic, indicators. These are the states of these two countries with the lowest, ESDI or whatever indicator you use in development. These are the lowest, states. So in that sense, we are actually jeopardized by kind of double landlocked situations. So that has been the biggest disadvantage for our economic development. And poor governance, we all know. We have seen, minimum governance, maximum government. That's just the opposite of the case that we wanted our country to be in. So that has also hampered our development. We have very poor infrastructure, and there's another economic situation that we are facing. I call it unholy trinity: low productivity, high price level, and low domestic saving. These are the three very important, thing that we are suffering from. We always had a history of low productivity because of the land prices and other inflations. We are in the high price level for such a long time, and we do not produce anything. There's a very little value addition in the economy. So our domestic saving happens to be very low. So these three things are really pulling us down from our aspirations of doing 7 or 8% of economic growth in the future. And the education system is really very bad. Unless we do something on our education system, we keep on sending our labor to abroad for next 20 years. Also after 20 years, also we can still see more than 1,500 Nepalese going abroad for sorts of jobs. So that is the situation. And what could be the key strategies? We have to control bank credit. We cannot keep on going like this. And, there was a time when we have been very complacent, but we cannot be anymore. Land price, we have to control land prices. We have to introduce austerity in public spending. Whereas we have to increase the public capex, but for the regular expenditure, we have to have control public expenditure on the regular side. And I won't say it for the manufactured goods, but of course it has to be for agricultural products. We should have a target of achieving, sufficiency in major food grains like wheat, rice, maize, and a few other products like vegetables. I think by 2030, and I think that's a doable target. And we need to promote weightless and borderless. I said in our this slide that we are landlocked, but by India and China. It's always difficult to negotiate or deal with India and China. Historically, that has been shown. So we need to now explore things beyond India and China. And then that one thing that comes up in my mind is the weightless and borderless exports. So that is a new area that we need to focus on. And we also have to transition from labor export to service export, and that's something that can be done. We really have to reform our education system. It is over politicalized, and in such a way that the education should produce human capital that can be part of global value chain. We should not be only thinking about sending our labor to Middle East or Malaysia, but thinking beyond that so that we can really be part of the global value chain. And we need to, one of the growth spots that I can see for next 5 years is that if we can shift from biomass based or cooking gas based cooking to electric cooking, I think lots of economic growth can come from this intervention. And I think in Nepal, I think we all understand it is because of the external remittance that the level of poverty in Nepal has really decreased significantly in the last 15 years or so. So, and we still have 18.7% of our populations who are on the poverty line. Okay, and I think the best thing that the state, or especially the local government, can do is to provide foreign employment opportunity to one member of the household from the marginalized groups, through state guaranteed credit, So these people are also honest to be able to repay that loan, the bank loan, as soon as they earn some money from their employment in the foreign countries. So I think that's one way to quickly uplift the poverty level. And I think what we need to do is, this assembly plan says it's not going to work in the context of Nepal. What we need to focus is those industries which use our factory endowments. Like what you can see that there is a great transformation in our cement sector because we have more than 180 years of limestone that's sufficient for our production for next 180 years. So those are the industries areas that we have to explore. So it has to be based on factory endowments, but otherwise, if you believe in importing raw materials from abroad and then processing it with very little value addition and you would like to re-export it, I think that business model is not going to work in Nepal because we do not have comparative advantage compared to India, China, and Bangladesh, which are much cost effective or has so much of advantage in that supply chain. The government has to increase capex to crowd in private sector investment. And I think I need to also say here that our labor market in certain sector is monopolized by Indian migrant workers. So the wage level in those sectors is very high. They are actually earning more than what they earn from similar job in India. I happened to stay in Punjab for 3 years for my PhD. And then there are some workers, they had been in Nepal and they were in Punjab. And he told me that he wants to come back to Nepal, because there's a greater chance of earning more in Nepal for similar kind of work. And it is monopolized by Indian workers. So there's a higher wage in those sectors. And we need to crack down on informal flows of foreign exchange. That's something that I think is happening in the economy since the pandemic. That's something. And also because I see the SARC is becoming more irrelevant by the day because India doesn't have interest to take it forward. So the India's interest is more into BBIN and probably BIMSTEC. So now we need to see beyond SARC. And for that, I think Bangladesh is going to be extremely important country for the Nepal, especially at times when the bilateral relationship between India and Bangladesh has really evolved and they are at the best of their times in terms of bilateral relationship. I think we need to capitalize on that. And I think there's one country that can have a say in a bilateral relationship between India and Nepal, and this is Bangladesh. And also because of the huge market that Bangladesh can offer in terms of export of our electricity and earthen materials, that's something that we need to also see what can be done to harness our hills, which has remained wasted for centuries. I think we need to think about what can be done with our hills. Because of all these reasons, I think Bangladesh has become extremely important for Nepal. And I think we need to see beyond SARC. And I think fuel security, we have only 1 week's of reserve. As far as petrol, diesel is concerned, I think we need to have at least 3 months of reserve to secure energy in Nepal. And the key priorities, I say that it is A, B, C, D, E, F, G of our key priorities. Some of the things I have already mentioned. A is agriculture, where we need to, by 2030, we need to have import substitution or self-sufficiency at least for major food grains, food items. Looking beyond SARC, Bangladesh is going to be a strategically very important country for us. And then C, if you think about weightless and borderless, I think carbon trade is going to be a new opportunities at the very large scale. And at the same time, I think when the advanced countries are aging in terms of its populations, and probably robot itself is not going to cater to the personalized needs of aging population in advanced countries, I think we, Nepal, can become very much part of that global value chain and really take advantage of that opportunities. And D, digital value chain on the weightless and borderless. I think this is happening already without much of government's effort. Private sector has led this process, and IIDS is right now doing some research on this because especially in the times when we are facing external sector challenges, I think digital value chain is going to offer some diversification as far as the foreign exchange revenues is concerned. And education, the way that we have educated our children is really bad. With the same education and over politicalization in education, probably we cannot graduate from lower middle class to upper middle class soon. So we need to reform this one. And factory environments, I already mentioned, we are very rich in water, minerals, forests, nature, and demography. And these are the things that we really have to harness to bring the economic growth that we need. And then, of course, green economy. Everyone is talking about green economy. And as much as we talk about green economy, I think it will only do good for us in terms of our economic growth. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gauchan. I think this was very, very comprehensive. I think you did not only discuss about the current challenges, but you gave a very good snapshot of Nepal's overall economy, where we are, how we have reached here, what needs to be done, actually what needed to be. I know, like we did not very good with time, but I did not want to intervene in between because this was going really very well. It was very interesting. I hope we can stretch a little further. For the time that we are taking a bit longer on this, but I hope we can, stay for a bit longer and go on with this discussion. But before I move on to Dr. Gunakar Bhatta, after which we will take the questions, which we already have actually in the chat box also. Dr. Gauchan, if you are comfortable with it, could you please share your presentation slides in the chat box, because we have got this request from a few participants about sharing the presentation with them. So if it's okay with you, if you could share it in the chat box.
Sure. I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I request our participants to please hold on, and also hold on with your questions. We will come to them after we hear from Dr. Gunakar Bhatta. Now, he's from the central bank. There are many things that came related to central bank as well that we saw in Dr. Gauchan's presentation. So it will be very interesting to hear from you, Dr. Bhatta. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. It was very for me as well to hear Dr. Gauchan, and also thank you for your invitation. We are also running out of time, so I think I don't have to cover much more number of issues and lot of elaborations Dr. Gauchan has already made, but definitely 3 or 4 points he has outlined, and I will follow them. Well, globally there are challenges and uncertainty, particularly in the post-pandemic recovery. There is huge uncertainty. That's because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the currency depreciation, rising oil prices. These are persistently taking toll on our foreign exchange reserve. That's a major challenge. And then how to manage our macroeconomy on different fronts in the fiscal sector. For example, in the context of Nepal, we are import dependent economy, and our source of the financing for the government is really the customs. So how that will be managed? These types of challenges are there. At the same time, in the last fiscal year, we depleted our foreign exchange reserve by $2 billion. So how we'll manage that in coming days ahead? They are really a challenge. And also globally, there is a hawkish monetary policy stance. And because of the hawkish monetary policy stance of the Federal Reserve, the capital flow from the emerging market economies that is going toward the advanced economies, particularly to the US. And that is also putting pressure on our FDI, maybe other sources of investment and other loans, even on the part of the governments, the grants and loans. That phenomenon will put pressure. And also already there is the risk of further currency depreciation in our case. So if we see the data, what Dr. Gauchan has also presented, there are some important lessons that we have to learn For example, during the 1970, 80, somewhere 42 years ago, only in the history, whatever the data we have, there was 10% the economic growth in a single year. So that's the exceptional. And we are talking about the double-digit growth. So how we'll move towards that double-digit growth? That's really a challenge for us. What will be the sources of financing, and how we'll build our infrastructures, institutions, and we are talking about the digitization. We are talking about the grid financing, climate change. These are the topical issues that today we have. So what will be the path of our sustainable development, and what will be the sustainable economic growth that we'll have to define? And the industrial growth that was particularly started in the mid 1980s, and that accelerated in the decade of 1990s, that slowed since this new millennia. So if we see the contribution of the industrial sector to GDP, that was in 1999, 2000, that was around 20%. And again, it has come down to 13 or around 14%. And similarly, the service sector has expanded, but to what extent it has contributed to the economic growth, and whether we can manage the shocks, we can avoid the risk they can emanate from the global financial development, global economic development, and the issue of the climate change. So how we'll manage this, and how we'll remain immune from these shocks? They are really the challenge. And two important points what Dr. Gauchan has outlined, and I would also like to reiterate that, well, financial development, or particularly in terms of the credit to the private sector, that has expanded significantly. So 7 years ago, if we see the balance sheet of the banks, the private sector credit was 56% of GDP, and in the last fiscal year, it reached 97% of GDP. So the private sector, or the individual, or the households, or the firms, they have been highly indebted. That's one trend, or one phenomenon that has outlined, and that has underlying consequences in the management of the financial system. Also, we'll have to examine how that is interlinked with the economic growth, how that is interlinked with the sustainable development. And that's one important point. And similarly, if we see the debt of the government 7 years ago, that was also 22% of GDP, and now it is around 42% of GDP. So whether that has contributed to the economic development, whether that has contributed to the sustainable development, and what will be the future path, these are the important issues that we'll have to discuss further. And some other developments, the internal migration in Nepal, which is rarely talked, that internal migration has made us further dependent on essential stock. For example, the vegetables, fruits, or the rice, whatever we have been importing, and what we have been telling to foreigners or to other people, that we have been importing these essential food stuff of more than 300 billion in a single year. So to what factors have they contributed to that? That's the important point. And what I think, that internal migration has also created pressure on the import of the essential stock. So the people from the rural areas, particularly hillside, they have been migrated to the urban areas in plain area, in terrain. So whatever the fruits, vegetables, or the the dairy product, or other food stock, they were produced in the villages. Now they have been replaced by the imported item. So this is the real challenge of mobilizing the internal production. How internal production system, how our federal development, that can be linked to the development and sustainable growth. These are the challenges. What we have seen in the last 5 years, well, the federal system has, to some extent, it has taken a shape, it has been established, but how that federal structure can be transformed, or how that can be capitalized to reap the benefit of the potentials there in the hillside, there in the rural areas. That's one major challenge. Sometimes people talk about the availability of the credit, the financial access. Well, these are the challenges, but not, the everything is linked with the money and banking. And I see the voices from the business people or from other communities that, well, the money and banking should be on the proper track, and then everything will be good. But For example, if we provide the agriculture credit to the farmer in the rural area, they can produce stuff, but the marketing of that stuff, the storage, the warehouse facility, and minimum support price. These are the marketing guarantee in nutshell. That is the challenge for the producers, local producers. So how we can ensure that, how we can build the institution, how we can build the system so that the financial development can be linked to the productivity and the production in the economy. That's one major challenge. Similarly, the government's financing, the debt financing of the government from different sources, either from internal sources or from the external sources, how that financing can be channelized towards the sustainable development in building infrastructure, in building good institutions. We all have been familiar with the theory that the total factor productivity or the good institutions, they are the driver for sustainable economic development. They are the driver for higher economic growth. But how we can build those institutions given the complex, the structure that we have now these days, that has also been an issue, that how the political economy related issues, how we can settle them, and how those issues, after settling those issues, how we can move onto the path of higher economic development, onto the path of sustainable economic growth. So these are the issues, and in different forums and from different quarters, we have to rethink whether the current the structure or the administrative structure, the political structure is paying, whether that is paving to the path of development and economic growth. Not only everything should be resided, not only we should rest on the financial development. Well, there has been significant development in the financial system. Definitely, how we can make it more inclusive, how we can make it more transparent, and how the needs, wants, and desires of the people in the backward regions, in the backward areas, they can be met by widening the financial net. That is a challenge. And in that regard, we have been working. The central bank has developed a number of avenues whereby the local people, they can have the access to the financial net. But more needs to be done. I do not disagree with that. But at the same time, other infrastructures, other institutions are to be in place. And then we can have the real impact from the financial development to the long-run economic growth and the sustainable development that we have been aspiring for long. So the global economy is uncertain today. There is huge uncertainty. There are signs of stagflation already in Europe and in some other parts of the world. There is a risk that 2023 will be the year of, again, a recession. So how we'll cope up with the challenges they will emanate from the global uncertainty, from the Russia-Ukraine war, that's on one side. And at the same time, how we can manage our home, how we can build better institutions whereby the other institutional development, particularly in the financial system, that can be linked to the development and growth. And then we can meet the expectations of the people of higher growth, poverty alleviation, and building a society where we can lower the income inequality. So we have to delve, and for that, I think globally, there are efforts on the climate change, green financing, how we can reap the benefit, particularly in terms of the grants, in terms of the assistance, and how we can design the path for sustainable development. And what will be the modality for sustainable development of the digitization, whereby that digitization, managing the risk, lowering the risk, that digitization can be transferred to the hands of each and every people living in the nook and corner of the country. So these are the issues, and already a number of issues Dr. Gauchan has presented in his presentation. I fully agree with him. And we have to build a framework. We have to build a society where the government's investment, the private sector investment is again leaned, that is, the move towards further research and development. And then we can move on a path of, the institutional building or another kind of the structural reform that is talked, on a number of occasions. So what will be the structural transformation for Nepal? We have to delve into the research and development, and then we have to move ahead. I think with this, let me stop here, given the time constraint. and given the comprehensive presentation that Dr. Gauchan has already made. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatta. Indeed, you very rightly said, the challenges that we are seeing today cannot be looked at only in one sector, and that cannot be addressed only by looking at one sector. There are many of these interlinked challenges that have to be addressed simultaneously. Very well said. Now, because we are running out of time, let's go straight onto the question and answer session now. We already have a few questions in the chat box. I would like to request our friends who have already written these questions, if you would like, perhaps it would be good that if you would, unmute and ask the question yourself. Let's try to make the question also very short, very brief, to the point, and the answer also very short and brief. First, let's go with Santosh Taka. Would you want to ask the question yourself first, and also to whom is this question directed to?
Hi, this is Santosh, and I'm in Maryland, in USA. It's almost around like 2:30 a.m. I actually enjoying very much, even though it's early morning here. So first of all, I want to thank the organizing committee to putting together such an excellent, presentation. My question is to both the presenters today. First, I'll go with Dr. Gauchan. The first thing is that I come to Nepal every time, in 5 years or 3 years or 10 years, since 2004. That's when I migrated to US. I keep on seeing the price of goods going exponentially high. For example, a cup of tea was around 5 rupees when I left Nepal. Now it's around 45 to 50 rupees in ordinary places. At least you cannot get less than 30 rupees anywhere. Same thing with the cost of vegetables, motorbikes, anything that I see is 100 or 200% more in the last 10 to 15 years. But the inflation seems to be in line, 6%, 7%, sometimes 4 to 5% with some other South Asian countries. Why is the cost of goods so high in Nepal? That's the first question to Dr. Gauchan. Can I also ask the second question right now, or shall I wait for later on?
Perhaps we wait for the next turn,
okay,
so that we give turn to others as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
Dr. Sharma, can I respond to
yes, sure.
Sure.
Okay.
I think you have rightly experienced the inflation that's going on in Nepal. As I said, that in the last 30, 40 years, the inflation has been around 7.75%, which is quite high. But if you take the example of our own peers, normally in developing countries or low-income countries, inflation has always been very high. And then the difference between advanced countries and poor countries or low-income countries is basically the inflation. But only change that we can see in recent months is that even in the advanced countries, the inflation has really gone up much beyond that the low-income countries are facing right now. For them, it is probably after 70s there or 80s they're experiencing high inflation. But in Nepal or other South Asian countries, you see this very much part of their macroeconomic situation. And in Nepal, because we import a lot, and that has also contributed. We import basically from India, 2/3 of our import coming from India. And so whatever inflation is India is also going to impact, that's one case. And another is the currency. As the dollar, strengthens against the currencies of developing countries like India or other neighboring countries in South Asia, that will also have an impact on our inflation. And these two factors are the major drivers of inflation in Nepal. And in addition to that, we also have a very long, supply chain, and that also adds to the inflation. As I said in my presentation, the trade is in Nepal is one of the major contributors to the GDP. But much of the trade, instead of value addition, what comes in there is a margin is of the business firms, because and the middlemen there. So they keep on adding. When we have more levels of the supply chain, each level will add more margin to in the process. So ultimately, that will have an impact on the prices of goods that the last consumers are going to bear. So these are the specific situation that has done much impact on the inflation. But if you compare with the Sri Lanka and Pakistan, we are much better. But it's only with other countries that we fare a little, less in the inflation in the region.
And
Thank you.
just I would like to add one point there. Well, the developed economies, they are on their path of steady state growth, and the inflation largely is stable there. The growth is stable, and countries like ours, which are the not secure in energy and food. So unless and until we have the food and energy security, and we show our competitive strength in the global market, then we might have to bear these consequences.
Thank you, Dr. Gauchan and Dr. Bhatta, for that response. If we have time, we'll come back to Santosh again for the second question. Let's take a few other questions from the chat box here. The next question was by Sampa Kundu. Are you there? Would you want to ask your question to the presenters yourself? Perhaps we don't have Sampa Kundu here. We might come back to it if we have time later on, because the question is there. Everyone can see the question. We can come back to this later. Go to the question by Biplab Paudel. Biplab Paudelji, if you would want to ask the question to the presenter yourself.
Hi everyone, myself Biplab Paudel. My question is to Dr. Gauchan sir. In one of the slides, what I have noticed is that the contribution of FDI in Nepal's GDP is very low, but the government of Nepal had organized various investment summit in a few years ago. So according to your point of view, is there any correlation between government investment summit and Nepal's FDI? And another question is linked to that is, could you please explain the legal procedures for the investor to invest in Nepal?
Thank you for that question. I didn't hear properly the second one, but the first one, Nepal, I think, is hosting this investment summit regularly, I guess so. But in terms of the impact of those summits, what happens is that during summit of these kinds, there are lots of pledges coming from foreign direct investors, different groups. But when it comes to actual translation, those commitments to reality, I think there's always a huge gap. It's not only about foreign direct investment. You take the example of, the post-earthquake reconstruction. There was such a large commitment of around $4 billion, but ultimately very few of that actually materialized. And the same thing is happening with these kind of summits. But the entire problem is the foreign FDI itself. If you, as I put in my presentation, it is less than 0.4%, which is very, very low, And because I said that our domestic saving is quite low, of a single digit, and most of the investment is going into land purchases, and the deploying back of profit into capital formation is very low. So our own domestic saving is not enough to raise the capital that is needed to achieve our economic growth of 7 or 8%. We necessarily have to rely on foreign direct investment, but the scale of investment in Nepal is pretty low. Number of things there. One is, of course, every time someone wants to bring FDI, they always have lots of complaints, lots of concerns about the processes that is involved. Though we have one window system, but in terms of their implementation, whether that's actually happening or not, there's a big question mark there. And at the same time, what I would also like to say is that those are the procedural parts apart. But for what, there would be a foreign direct investment. I think the only motivation of any investor would be to have a profit, they want to earn profit, take that profit back to their home. So what are the areas that can really excite them in terms of their prospect for their investment in terms of earning good profitability? And I have myself, a big, huge question about this profitability. Which are the sectors that we have opened up for foreign direct investment so that they can really have a good return on their investment? So I think we need to see it from a very holistic approach. Simplifying procedure is one thing, but the real thing is for what? For which sector? Which are the sectors that really can give them the higher return compared to other competing economies which are offering them a similar kind of incentive or privileges? So that's what I would like to respond to this question.
Thank you, Dr. Gauchan. There is a comment from Dr. Bijan Bhattarai. Rather than a question, it's a comment.
Dr. Puspa, I was also trying to address that question.
Yes, so
I fully agree with him. So we have to reframe our policies and not the blanket, but the targeted, the credit subsidy should be given. That's also my view. I fully agree with his opinion, what he has been referring. And I've also been, the lobbying for the same here at the central bank and with the Minister of Finance, that not the blanket facility should be given in the subsidized areas, whatever we have been talking, rather it should be targeted.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatta. I was wanting to come to you because I think this was more relevant to you.
With that observation, let me thank you here. And another meeting immediately. Colleagues, friends from the World Bank are also here in my office. They have been also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bhatta. We'll communicate again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So perhaps we will take the last question from Mr. Santosh Chakal. He's from Maryland and he's been participating at a very odd hour. So I think you deserve to have a second question, perhaps to Dr. Gauchan, if it is so. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was also trying to ask Dr. Bhatta, but I'll go ahead and ask Dr. Gauchan. Actually, it's not a question, but it's kind of like a thing that I have been observing. First thing is, Dr. Gauchan covered the whole macro and microeconomics that I studied while I was doing my MBA even more. So it went out of my brain, some of the things, but I came back to realize few things. The first thing is, I agree and disagree with one of the things that you said regarding the processing of raw materials. You may be right, in regards of Banaspati ghee or even the supari thing going on right now in Nepal that comes from other country and goes back to India. But think about other things like furniture, solar panels, even like motorbikes or cars, those type of things. Nepal has a very good and unique niche market. And the reason I'm saying is there's a country, Vietnam, when the US put an embargo on Chinese goods, the goods started flowing from Vietnam. It was the same thing. It was just assembled in Vietnam. So we should not directly say the assembling process or, the value-added chain may not add to the economics of Nepal if you turn it around and see if we can use that niche market. Like if suppose US doesn't want to import goods from China, the goods can still come to Nepal, be assembled and come to developed countries. So there's a good niche market there. But my other question really is the price of land in Nepal. I'm so surprised because I work in a real estate development here for the last 16 years. Every 10 years we get a recession. Automatically we adjust the value of real estate is adjusted by supply and demand. But in Nepal, you're right, most of the money is made in real estate. And the price of land and price of even houses are going astronomically, in a very high percentage, always upward trend. So my question is, where is the money coming from in Nepal? How is this real market so much sustainable when there is such a high inflation and there is less gross domestic product, there is less of, everything is less in Nepal in terms of revenue, but the price of land is still sustainable at this point. That is my question to Dr. Bhatta.
Okay, thank you very much for wonderful questions. Those two are very relevant to today's topic also. Let me go with your second question about the land price. The money is coming from the margins that the business people are getting because they don't have much avenues to invest in production. So what they will do is, because the margin is very good in Nepal. If there's a trader who imports and sells, okay, there's a very good margin. So the person or the business firm tends to make very good money out of those transactions. So what these people will do is, because there's no other productive investment that they can make, the easiest and the high return sector is real estate, as you have said. Yeah. So they park that money into real estate, because as I said, every 3.7 years, the price of the land in an average doubles. So I think that's going to be a very good income for them without doing much. Okay. And then who is supporting that? The banking sector, the credit, most of the credit I talked to you about, I mentioned about the agri-washing. That part of that agri-washing is going into the real estate. In many forms, in Nepal, we have different sectors. There's certain credit guidance from the bank. They might not be, used for the intended purpose. Where it goes, where it is parked, ultimately is in the real sector. So, there's a great demand for land in Nepal. So the price it goes up every time. So and then also, as I said, lots of unaccounted money in Nepal. There's no proper source of income, So the best way to convert, if you really want to, you have made huge money from your business and you account very less income and you pay very little tax on that, okay, or don't pay any tax. And the best way to, formalize or make it wide is to do a land transaction. You go and buy, no one asks you about the income source, document, or no one asks from where you get this money. And then after, if you want to, make it, convert it into the white money, then you can simply sell it and you can show it as a source of your income. And even central bank, accepts it as a valid source of income. So that's why this circle is happening in land, price. And the second question about the value chain in Nepal, as I said, 52% of import is on the intermediate goods. Okay, but those intermediate goods are almost finished goods. Okay, so there's a very little value addition that goes into the economy. Okay, that's one thing. And another thing is that you rightly mentioned the Vietnam. Vietnam is a major beneficiary of China plus one, the concept that's coming up. And even before that, Vietnam was doing quite good in its economy. Lots of productions they have taken up. But why that is not possible in Nepal is that we do not have economies of scale benefit in Nepal. Okay, and in addition to that, our logistics, the infrastructure is so in a poor state. How can you really take benefit of a low income category, where low income category means your wages is also supposed to be low. But as I said, our minimum wage is the highest in the region. So these are some of the anomalies that will not allow you to make our economic competitive, and the value addition as assembly plants. I told you less than 5% of value addition, and you are giving all the privilege to these people, okay, who are taking benefit of all the, this subsidy or these privileges with less than 5% of value addition. And if you see the number of people employed by those assembly plants, you will see 90% of them are Indian workers. Okay, they simply have to do, this not a bold kind of work they have to do. Okay, but for that also they need Indian workers to, to do that. And another is that China also started with the imported parts. Okay, it assembled there and re-exported, how it developed. But in the process, what China did was it started manufacturing those parts itself. But can you think down the line in 20 years, can really, produce this the parts? No, it's not going to happen, because we do not have any advantage of economies of scale, and we cannot compete because our capital cost is very high, poor infrastructure here, and then we are landlocked, and that too by India and China. Lots of complications are there, and I never think that Nepal can really be able to position itself as a manufacturing or assembly hub. So I think we need to forget about that. As far as I'm concerned, my own analysis says that we need to forget about that. But now focus on borderless and weightless thing. And one opportunity there is that being part of the global digital value chain is a new opportunity for us. Okay. So what is the thing about that is our youth can stay back home in Nepal, but by working through the internet, they can be very much part of the global digital value chain. And that, I think that is the new, new Nepal. That I can foresee. And but as part of the backward linkages, we have to invest in education to produce that kind of human capital. And where I think we need to do a lot through education reform. So these are this is where I stop. I don't know whether I was able to answer to your questions or not.
Thank you, Dr. Gauchan. I think you answered it quite well. And indeed, I think services sector is what Nepal really has to focus on. And that is the area that Nepal also can do relatively well, provided that we put a lot of focus on human development that includes health education and other areas. With the rise of information technology and the catching up that many countries have been able to do, perhaps there is also this opportunity for Nepal where we can catch up. So, I mean, looking at the overall presentation, what we heard today, I think currently, given the kind of challenges that we are seeing all across the world, the macroeconomic and fiscal challenges, I think there isn't much, so much that Nepal needs to be worried about. Because we are doing pretty well in terms of, if you look at our revenue or our sovereign debt, the public debt, also our foreign exchange reserve. We are not in a very bad position, but I think there are other fundamentals that need to be taken care of. So I will not attempt to summarize what we have discussed today, because this was very comprehensive. I think Dr. Gauchan gave us very good overview of like where we are, what needs to be done. And because we have run out of time already, we have taken more than half an hour actually of our scheduled time. I would like to thank Dr. Gauchan especially and Dr. Bhatta for a very extensive presentation, for illuminating us on what we wanted to discuss in here today. Thanks to our participants from Nepal and beyond. Thank you so much for your participation. Thanks to those who asked questions and tried to make this lively and interactive. We will hopefully organize more of these kinds of sessions in the days to come, and we hope we will be having your participation again in the future. So with these words, I would like to thank you all once again and say have a good day, good evening, good afternoon, as is relevant to wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Gauchan.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Biswash Gauchan from SANEM. Thank you, Dr. Puspa Sharma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shoaib.
Thank you, organizers. It was really active, glad to be here. It was very interactive session.
Yes.
Thank you, Santosh,
Yes,
for that very, being there at very odd hour. We will talk. Bye.
Bye.